December 7th, 1941. A Sunday morning in Hawaii. Bombs falling on Pearl Harbor. Battleships burning. 2,400 Americans dead. And in an instant, the United States was at war, a war that would demand everything the nation had. Every resource, every factory, every able body. Think about the scale of what happened next. The math was simple and terrifying. America needed millions of men in uniform immediately. Men to fight in Europe. Men to island hop across the Pacific. Men to cruise ships, fly planes, drive tanks, and storm beaches. But there was a problem. A massive, unprecedented problem. There weren't enough men. The armed forces needed to grow. From fewer than 200,000 active personnel to over 12 million. 12 million. The draft was already pulling men from farms, factories, offices, and shops. Production had to increase exponentially: planes, ships, tanks, ammunition, everything. But who would build these weapons if the workers were all going to war? And who would handle the mountains of paperwork, the communications, the medical care, the 1,000 administrative tasks that made a modern military function? The answers seemed impossible in 1941. It went against everything American society believed about gender roles, about women's place, about propriety and capability. The answer was women. But in 1941, suggesting that women serve in the military, actually wear the uniform, take orders, live in barracks, do men's jobs, was radical. Shocking to many. The military establishment was overwhelmingly opposed. The public was skeptical. Cultural norms said women were too delicate for military discipline, too emotional for the stress, too weak for the physical demands. Women belonged at home, raising children, managing households. That was the conventional wisdom. There were exceptions, of course. The Army Nurse Corps and Navy Nurse Corps had existed for decades. But nurses were different, the thinking went. Nursing was an extension of women's natural caregiving role. And even then, nurses weren't given full military rank or benefits. They occupied a strange in-between space, serving in war zones but not quite soldiers. In early 1941, before Pearl Harbor, a congresswoman from Massachusetts named Edith Nourse Rogers saw what was coming. Rogers had served as a nurse's aide in World War I. She'd seen women volunteer to serve and then get discarded afterward with no benefits, no recognition, no protection. She knew that if America entered another war, women would be needed again. And she was determined that this time they would be treated fairly. In May 1941, 7 months before Pearl Harbor, Rogers introduced a bill to create a women's corps in the Army. The bill went nowhere. The military didn't want it. Congress didn't take it seriously. The country wasn't at war yet, so why bother? Then came December 7th. Everything changed. Suddenly, the impossible became necessary. Representative Rogers reintroduced her bill. This time, with American ships sinking and casualties mounting, people listened. But they didn't embrace it. The debate was fierce. Opponents argued that putting women in uniform would destroy military discipline, that it was unfeminist to ask women to take on masculine roles, that American women were too refined for military life. Some said it was a sign of weakness, that America couldn't defend itself without resorting to using women. Others worried about morality, about men and women serving together, about what it would do to families and children. But the math didn't lie. The War Department ran the numbers. To field the military America needed and to keep production running, women had to serve. Not as a nice gesture, not as a patriotic symbol, as an absolute necessity. Without women in uniform and in factories, America could not win the war. It was that simple. General George Marshall, Army Chief of Staff, looked at the manpower crisis and made a calculation. He didn't particularly want women in the army, but he needed them. A compromise emerged. The women's corps would be auxiliary, attached to the army but not fully in it. They wouldn't have the same rank structure, the same pay, the same benefits. They'd be called the Women's Auxiliary Army Corps, WAC. The auxiliary label was a way to get skeptics on board. It suggested this was temporary, separate, not really the same as men serving. On May 15, 1942, 5 months after Pearl Harbor, President Franklin Roosevelt signed the bill into law. The WAC was born. It was a grudging, compromised beginning. But it was a beginning. The woman chosen to lead this experimental unit was Oveta Culpabi, a newspaper executive and Texas power broker. Hobby was respectable, connected, and competent, exactly the kind of leader who could navigate the political minefield of women in the army. She understood that every move would be scrutinized, every failure magnified, every success downplayed. The women of the WAC would have to be beyond reproach. They'd have to be better than the men they were replacing. They'd have to prove, every single day, that they deserved to wear the uniform. On July 20th, 1942, the first WAC training center opened at Fort Des Moines, Iowa. 440 women arrived for the first officer candidate class. Newspapers and newsreels covered it extensively. The public was curious. Could women really march in formation? Could they handle military discipline? Would they break down under pressure? The cameras captured everything: women drilling, saluting, learning to read maps, studying military regulations. It was a spectacle, and it was a test. The women came from every background: teachers, secretaries, factory workers, college graduates, mothers, daughters. Some had never been away from home before. Others had traveled the world. What they had in common was a desire to serve, to do something that mattered, to be part of the war effort in a way that was more than buying war bonds or knitting socks. They wanted to wear the uniform. They wanted to be soldiers, even if the army wouldn't quite call them that yet. The training was real military training. 6 weeks of drills, marching, physical fitness, military protocol. They learned to salute properly, to stand at attention, to maintain discipline. The instructors didn't go easy on them. They couldn't afford to. These women would be sent to army posts around the country and eventually around the world. They had to be prepared. They had to represent not just themselves, but the idea that women could serve. Picture what was happening at the same time. While the debate over the WAC raged, while society wrestled with the idea of women in uniform, tens of thousands of women were already serving in the Army Nurse Corps and Navy Nurse Corps. And they were going into combat zones. When the United States entered the war in December 1941, there were fewer than 1,000 Army nurses on active duty and 700 in the Navy. By the end of the war, the Army and Army Air Forces had 54,000 nurses. The Navy had 11,000, all women. These nurses didn't stay safely behind the lines. They followed invasions. They set up field hospitals under fire. They worked in hospital ships that were torpedoed. They were captured and held as prisoners of war. They endured conditions that would break many people. In the Philippines, when American forces surrendered to Japan in 1942, 68 American military women, most of them nurses, became prisoners of war. They spent years in internment camps, starving, diseased, watching patients die from lack of supplies. They didn't give up. They kept nursing. They kept their patients alive with almost nothing. In North Africa, nurses landed with the invasion forces in 1942. They worked in evacuation hospitals just behind the front lines, treating men straight from battle. In Italy, at Anzio, nurses dug foxholes outside their hospital tents. German artillery shells landed around them while they operated on wounded soldiers. The patients could hear the explosions. They could see the nurses, calm and focused, continuing their work. The soldiers said it gave them courage. If the nurses could stay steady under shell fire, so could they. On June 10th, 1944, 4 days after D-Day, the first nurses landed on Normandy Beach. The invasion was barely secured. The fighting was still intense, but the wounded were piling up and they needed care immediately. The nurses came ashore, set up field hospitals and tents, and started operating. Over the next months, as Allied forces pushed across France and into Germany, the nurses followed. They treated casualties from the Battle of the Bulge, from the crossing of the Rhine, from the final push into Germany. 16 Army nurses were killed by enemy fire during World War II. More than 1,600 received decorations for bravery and meritorious service. 565 WACs serving in the Pacific Theater earned combat decorations. The nurses proved, from the beginning, that women could serve in war zones, that they could handle the stress, the danger, the horror. But they were nurses, and somehow that was acceptable to a society that couldn't yet accept women in other military roles. Nurses were caregivers. That fit the stereotype. What came next didn't fit any stereotype. In September 1942, while the WAC was still getting started, two extraordinary women were working on something even more radical. Jacqueline Cochran and Nancy Harkness Love were both accomplished pilots. Not hobbyists, not dabblers. They were among the best pilots in America, male or female. And they both had the same idea. With experienced male pilots desperately needed for combat, why not use women pilots to ferry planes from factories to military bases? To test aircraft after repairs? To tow targets for anti-aircraft gunnery practice? Women could do these jobs, freeing up male pilots for combat duty. The Army Air Forces were skeptical. Flying wasn't like nursing. Flying was technical, dangerous, demanding. It required strength, quick reflexes, cool judgment under pressure. Could women handle it? Cochran and Love didn't argue. They demonstrated. In September 1942, two separate programs were created as experiments. Love founded the Women's Auxiliary Ferrying Squadron, WFS. Cochran founded the Women's Flying Training Detachment, WFD. Both programs recruited women who were already licensed pilots, not student pilots, not beginners. Women with hundreds of hours of flight time. Women who could already fly and just needed military training. The requirements were steep. WFS applicants needed a commercial pilot's license, 500 hours of flight time, and experience in high-powered aircraft. WFD applicants needed at least 200 hours. Even with these high bars, more than 25,000 women applied. 25,000. The vast majority were rejected. Only the very best were accepted. In August 1943, the two programs merged into a single organization, the Women Air Force Service Pilots, WASP. At Avenger Field in Sweetwater, Texas, WASP trainees underwent 7 months of intensive flight training. They flew every day. They studied navigation, meteorology, engines, military regulations. They did calisthenics, marched, took tests. The washout rate was high. About 40% didn't make it through. But those who graduated became military pilots, sort of. The catch, the absurd bureaucratic catch, was that WASP were classified as civil service employees, not military. They wore uniforms. They lived on military bases. They took orders from military commanders. They flew military aircraft on military missions. But they weren't soldiers. They weren't officers. They weren't even veterans. This classification meant that when a WASP died in service, and 38 did, her family received no military burial, no flag, no benefits. Her fellow WASP would take up a collection to pay for the casket and ship the body home. It was an injustice that wouldn't be corrected for more than 30 years. But in 1943 and 1944, the WASP flew. They ferried every type of aircraft the military had: trainers, fighters, bombers. PT-19s, P-51 Mustangs, B-17 Flying Fortresses, B-29 Super Fortresses. They flew brand new planes from factories to air bases. They flew repaired planes on test flights. Dangerous work because if the repairs were faulty, the plane might fail in midair. They towed targets behind their planes so anti-aircraft gunners could practice shooting. They flew simulated strafing missions to train ground troops. They transported cargo, personnel, and equipment all over the country. Think about the scale of their contribution. They flew 60 million miles during the war. 60 million. They delivered more than 12,000 aircraft. Male pilots who were skeptical at first became believers. The WASP could fly anything, and they flew it well. There were reports of male pilots refusing to fly certain aircraft, like the B-26 Marauder, which had a reputation for being difficult and dangerous. So the Army sent WASP to fly them. The women flew the B-20 SIXS without incident, and suddenly male pilots were willing to fly them too. If a woman could do it, their pride demanded they could do it too. 38 WASP died in service. Plane crashes, mechanical failures, accidents during training. Gertrude Tompkins disappeared on a ferry mission in 1944 and was never found. Her fate remains a mystery. These women gave their lives, and the nation barely noticed because they weren't officially military. When the war in Europe started winding down in late 1944 and male pilots were coming back, the WASP program was abruptly shut down on December 20th, 1944. No ceremony, no benefits, just a thank you and a bus ticket home. It would take until 1977, 33 years, for Congress to finally grant WASP veteran status. In 2009, the surviving WASP received the Congressional Gold Medal. Better late than never, but it shouldn't have taken that long. While the WAC was forming and the WASP were flying, the Navy was facing its own manpower crisis. Unlike the Army, the Navy had never used women except as nurses. But by 1942, it was clear that wouldn't be enough. On July 30th, 1942, President Roosevelt signed the Navy Women's Reserve Act into law. The Navy's women's branch was called WAVES, Women Accepted for Volunteer Emergency Service. The acronym was carefully crafted to emphasize that these women were volunteers and temporary. The message was clear: this wasn't permanent, just for the emergency. Mildred McAfee, president of Wellesley College, was chosen to direct the WAVES. Like Oveta Kulpabi with the WAC, McAfee was a respectable, educated, accomplished woman who could give the program credibility. The WAVES set up training at Smith College in Massachusetts. Unlike the WAC, WAVES were given full Navy rank from the beginning, both officer and enlisted. But there were restrictions. WAVES couldn't serve on ships. They couldn't serve overseas. They were for shore duty only, to free up men for sea duty. By the end of 1942, there were 770 WAVES officers and more than 3,000 enlisted. Those numbers grew rapidly. By 1945, there were more than 8,000 officers and over 73,000 enlisted, a total of more than 82,000 WAVES. They served at 900 different shore installations across the United States. The Navy opened 38 ratings, job classifications, to women. The majority of WAVES worked as yeomen, the Navy's clerical specialists. About 14,000 WAVES served as yeomen, handling the endless paperwork that kept the Navy running. Another 13,000 served as hospital corpsmen, providing medical care. But WAVES also filled technical roles. They worked as aviation mechanics, radio operators, parachute riggers, link trainer instructors teaching pilots how to fly instruments, and air traffic controllers. Some of the most secretive work was done by WAVs who served as codebreakers in Washington, working for the Office of Naval Operations Communication Division. These women intercepted and decoded enemy messages. They couldn't talk about their work, not during the war, not for decades afterward. But they were reading Japanese and German communications, providing intelligence that saved lives and won battles. The Coast Guard and Marine Corps created their own women's reserves. The Coast Guard called their spars, from the Coast Guard motto, Semper Paratus, always ready. About 10,000 women served in the spars. The Marine Corps Women's Reserve didn't have a catchy acronym. They were just women Marines. About 23,000 served. The Marines were particularly resistant to the idea of women in their ranks. The Corps prided itself on being the toughest, most elite fighting force. But even the Marines needed clerks, drivers, cooks, and mechanics. And women could do those jobs just as well as men. Consider what had happened by mid-1943. Women were serving in every branch of the military. But the WAC's auxiliary status was causing problems. Recruiting was suffering because women didn't get the same benefits as men. And legally, the women weren't really soldiers, which created all kinds of bureaucratic headaches. General Marshall and other army leaders went back to Congress. They needed the auxiliary designation dropped. They needed women to be fully in the army, with full benefits and protection. In July 1943, Congress passed a new law. The Women's Auxiliary Army Corps became the Women's Army Corps. Auxiliary was gone. These were soldiers. WACs. They had the same rank, the same pay, the same benefits as male soldiers. The 16,000 women who had joined the WAC had to choose, sign up again for the WAC with full status or go home. 75% signed up again. They wanted to be soldiers officially. The question America had wrestled with for a year and a half was answered. Women could serve. They could handle the training, the discipline, the work. They could deploy overseas. They could contribute to the war effort in ways no one had imagined in 1941. Over the next 2 years, more than 150,000 women would serve in the WAC. They would deploy to North Africa, Europe, and the Pacific. They would serve in every theater of the war. And they would prove, beyond any doubt, that when the nation called, women answered. The resistance hadn't disappeared. The skepticism hadn't vanished. There were still men and women who believed this was wrong, unnatural, dangerous. But the war didn't care about cultural norms. The war demanded every person who could serve. And 350,000 American women in uniform, plus millions more in factories and shipyards, were going to transform not just the military, but the entire nation. Fort Des Moines, Iowa. Summer of 1942. The first WAC officer candidates were learning what it meant to be soldiers. The schedule started at 0600 hours, 6 in the morning. Physical training. Breakfast. Then classes all day. Military customs and courtesies. Map reading. First aid. Army organization. How to command. How to follow orders. How to wear the uniform correctly. How to salute. How to march in formation without looking awkward. The instructors were tough. They had to be. These women would be leading other women, and they had to command respect from male soldiers who didn't want them there. The physical training wasn't brutal, but it wasn't easy either. Calisthenics every morning. Long marches with full packs. The women had to prove they could handle physical demands. Not the same demands as infantry soldiers, they weren't training for combat, but enough to show they had stamina and discipline. Some women dropped out. The training was harder than they'd expected. The military life wasn't what they'd imagined. But most stayed. Most pushed through the fatigue, the homesickness, the moments of doubt. What surprised many observers was how well the women performed. Their discipline records were better than comparable male units. They showed up on time. They followed orders. They took the training seriously. The stereotype had been that women would be emotional, unreliable, unable to handle stress. The reality was different. These women had volunteered knowing they'd face skepticism and resistance. They'd self-selected for determination. By September 1942, the first WAC companies were being assigned to Army posts around the country. They worked primarily in administrative roles: clerks, typists, file managers, switchboard operators. The work wasn't glamorous. It was tedious, essential work that kept the military bureaucracy functioning. Every order had to be typed. Every personnel file had to be maintained. Every requisition had to be processed. Before the WAC, soldiers did this work. Now WACs did it, and those soldiers could go fight. The slogan was everywhere: "Release a man for combat." That was the pitch. That was how the WAC justified its existence to a skeptical public. Women weren't taking men's jobs. They were freeing men to do what only men could do: fight. It was a compromise with traditional gender roles. It acknowledged that combat was still men's work, but everything else could be shared. And in 1942, that compromise was necessary. The country wasn't ready for women in combat, but it was ready, barely, for women in uniform doing support work. Director Hobby was constantly managing the WAC's reputation. There were rumors, spread by people who opposed the program, that WACs were prostitutes, that the Army was issuing them contraceptives, that the women were immoral. None of it was true. But the rumors spread anyway, damaging recruitment. Hobby launched a public relations campaign to counter the smears. She emphasized the respectability of the women, their education levels, their patriotism. She made sure photographers captured WACs looking professional, disciplined, feminine, but not provocative. The message was, these are good American girls doing their duty. Picture what the nurses were facing at the same time. While debates about women's propriety continued back home, Army nurses were proving themselves in far more dangerous circumstances. When American forces invaded North Africa in November 1942, Operation Torch, Army nurses went with them. They landed in Algeria and Morocco and immediately set up evacuation hospitals. The casualties started coming in from the first days of fighting. Soldiers wounded by German artillery, machine gun fire, landmines. The nurses worked around the clock. They performed surgeries in tents with inadequate light and supplies. They learned to prioritize, triage, deciding who to treat first, who could wait, who was beyond help. It was brutal work, emotionally and physically. In January 1943, the Casablanca Conference brought President Roosevelt, Prime Minister Churchill, and their staffs to North Africa to plan the next phase of the war. Army nurses were there, treating Allied casualties from the ongoing campaign. They were part of the war machine now, as essential as the soldiers, the pilots, the supply officers. The military couldn't function without them. By mid-1943, Army Nurse Corps strength had grown to 36,000. The Navy Nurse Corps had grown to 4,000. These numbers would continue to climb. The services couldn't get enough nurses. Civilian nurses were recruited aggressively. The Army and Navy offered officer commissions, decent paid adventure, and the chance to serve. For many young women with nursing degrees, it was an opportunity they couldn't get in civilian life. In 1943, hospitals were still segregated, and opportunities for women, especially women of color, were limited. The military wasn't perfect, but it offered more. Second Lieutenant Elsie Ott was a flight nurse assigned to evacuate wounded soldiers from North Africa back to the United States. In January 1943, She accompanied 5 patients on a 5-day flight from North Africa to Washington, D.C. The flight crossed the Atlantic, refueling in South America. UP monitored the patients continuously, adjusting oxygen levels, administering medications, keeping them stable at high altitude. It was the first intercontinental air evacuation mission, and UP managed it flawlessly. She received the Air Medal, the first woman ever to receive that decoration. Her success proved that air evacuation was viable, and soon it became standard practice. Thousands of wounded soldiers were flown home instead of spending weeks on hospital ships. Many lives were saved because flight nurses like Ott showed it could be done. In July 1943, the WAC became the WAC. The transformation was more than symbolic. Full military status meant better pay, benefits, and legal protections. It meant that WACs who died in service would receive military burials. It meant their families would receive death benefits. It meant they were soldiers, not auxiliaries. Recruiting improved immediately. Women who had hesitated because of the auxiliary status now signed up. By the end of 1943, WAC strength reached 60,000. The peak would come in 1945 with over 100,000 WACs serving simultaneously. The WACs were starting to deploy overseas. In late 1943, the first WAC units arrived in North Africa, assigned to Allied Force Headquarters in Algiers. General Dwight Eisenhower, Supreme Commander of Allied Forces, requested them specifically. He'd seen how effectively WACs worked stateside, and he needed that efficiency in his headquarters. The WACs assigned to North Africa worked in intelligence, communications, supply, and administration. They processed classified documents, decoded messages, tracked troop movements, managed logistics for the upcoming invasion of Italy. When Allied forces invaded Italy in September 1943, WACs were part of the headquarters staff managing the operation. They weren't on the front lines, but they were close to it. When the headquarters moved, they moved. When German artillery targeted the command posts, they took cover like everyone else. They learned to distinguish the sound of incoming rounds from outgoing. They learned to work through air raids. They adapted. General Mark Clark, commander of the Fifth Army in Italy, was impressed. He'd been skeptical about women in the army, but the WACs assigned to his headquarters were outstanding. He requested more. By early 1944, there were hundreds of WACs in Italy, and they were expanding into more roles. Postal clerks, photo analysts examining reconnaissance images, motor pool drivers, communications specialists. Some WACs spoke Italian and served as interpreters. Others worked in prisoner of war interrogation centers, translating documents. Think about the scale of what was being planned next. In England, preparations for D-Day were accelerating. The invasion of France would be the largest amphibious operation in history, and the logistical planning was staggering. Thousands of ships, tens of thousands of vehicles, millions of supplies. Everything had to be tracked, organized, loaded, and delivered to the right place at the right time. WACs assigned to Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force, SHEF, worked on invasion planning. They prepared maps, processed intelligence reports, managed personnel assignments. They knew the invasion was coming, though they didn't know exactly when. Security was intense. They couldn't talk about their work, couldn't write home about what they saw. On June 6, 1944, D-Day, Allied forces stormed the beaches of Normandy. The first waves were all men. Combat infantry, engineers, medics. The casualties were horrific. But the invasion succeeded. Within days, the Allies had secured a beachhead and were pushing inland. On June 10th, just 4 days after D-Day, Army nurses landed on Omaha Beach. They waded through water carrying their gear, climbed the bluffs, and set up field hospitals. The wounded were still coming in by the hundreds. The nurses worked in tents with dirt floors, often under canvas that didn't keep out the rain. They operated by flashlight when generators failed. They worked until they collapsed, then got up and worked some more. Lieutenant Frances Slanger was a surgical nurse with the 45th Field Hospital. In mid-October 1944, her unit was near Elsenborn, Belgium, close to the German border. On October 21st, Slanger wrote a letter to Stars and Stripes, the military newspaper. She wrote about the soldiers she'd treated, their courage, their resilience, their gratitude. She wrote about how humbling it was to care for them, how much the nurses admired the men they served alongside. The letter was heartfelt and beautifully written. It was published on November 7th. By then, Frances Slanger was dead. On October 21st, hours after she mailed the letter, a German artillery shell hit her tent. She was killed instantly. She was 30 years old. The soldiers who read her letter in Stars and Stripes didn't know, at first, that she was gone. They wrote back to her. The letters kept coming for weeks. "Thank you. You saved my life. You're heroes too." The letters were forwarded to her family. By the end of 1944, there were 8,000 WACs serving in the European theater. They were in England, France, Belgium, eventually Germany. They followed the advancing armies, setting up offices, communication centers, supply depots. When Paris was liberated in August 1944, WACs arrived within weeks. When the Allies crossed into Germany in early 1945, WACs weren't far behind. Some WACs were in Reims, France, when Germany surrendered on May 7, 1945. They'd been part of the headquarters staff that processed the surrender documents. Avenger Field, Sweetwater, Texas. The only all-woman military flight training base in American history. From 1943 to 1944, this dusty airfield in West Texas was where the women Air Force service pilots learned to fly military aircraft. The trainees, called WFTDs from the initials WFD, arrived from all over the country. They were already pilots. They'd paid for their own flying lessons, logged hundreds of hours, earned licenses. But civilian flying and military flying were different worlds. The training was 7 months long. Ground school covered navigation, meteorology, mathematics, engines, aerodynamics, military regulations. Flight training progressed from small trainers to more powerful aircraft. PT-19s, VT-13s at SIXS. Each plane was faster, heavier, more demanding than the last. The women learned to fly in formation, to navigate by instruments, to handle emergencies. They learned to fly at night, in bad weather, with one engine out. The instructors were male civilian pilots, many of them tough, skeptical at first. But when they saw the women could fly, the skepticism faded. Competence earned respect. Imagine trying to master this under these conditions. The physical training was demanding. Calisthenics, marching, long runs in the Texas heat. The women wore bulky flight suits that didn't fit properly. They were men's sizes, designed for men's bodies. The parachutes were too big. The cockpits were designed for men. Everything about military aviation was built for male pilots, and the women had to adapt. They sat on cushions to reach the rudder pedals. They adjusted seats and harnesses as much as possible. They made it work. Not everyone made it through. About 40% of trainees washed out. Some couldn't handle the academic work. Some couldn't master the flying skills. Some got sick or injured. Some decided military flying wasn't for them. But those who graduated, more than 1,000, became military pilots. Or rather, they became pilots doing military work without being military. The bureaucratic classification still rankled. They wore uniforms designed by Bergdorf Goodman. They lived on military bases. They took orders from military officers. But they were civil service employees, paid less than male pilots, with no benefits. Jacqueline Cochran, the director of WASP, had fought to get her pilots full military status. She testified before Congress. She lobbied generals and politicians. But the bill to militarize the WASP stalled. Some male pilots opposed it, worried about competition. Some congressmen didn't think women should be military pilots. Some people thought the program was unnecessary now that male pilots were available. The bill failed, and in December 1944, the WASP program was shut down. Here's what makes their contribution so remarkable. Before that shutdown, the WASP flew. They ferried more than 12,000 aircraft from factories to air bases. They flew 60 million miles. They towed targets for anti-aircraft gunnery practice, dangerous work because sometimes the gunner's aim was bad and the plane, not the target, got hit. They flew simulated strafing and bombing missions to train ground troops. They transported cargo and personnel. They flight-tested aircraft after repairs, extremely dangerous work because if the mechanics had made a mistake, the plane might fail catastrophically. Male pilots often refused test flight assignments. Too risky. So WASP flew them. WASP flew every aircraft the Army Air Forces had. PT-19 Cornells, BT-13 Valiants, at 6 Texans, P-39 Airacobras, P-40 Warhawks, P-47 Thunderbolts, P-51 Mustangs, P-63 King Cobras, B-17 Flying Fortresses, B-24 Liberators, B-25 Mitchells, B-26 Marauders, B-29 Super Fortresses. They flew fighters and bombers, trainers, and transports. Some WASP pilots had more flight hours in B-17s than male combat pilots. The B-26 Marauder was known as the Widowmaker because of its high accident rate early in the war. Male pilots at one base refused to fly it. The commanding officer called in WASP. The women flew the B-20 SIXS without incident, demonstrating that the plane was safe if flown properly. Suddenly, the male pilot's reluctance disappeared. If women could fly it, they could fly it. Ego overcame fear. The B-29 Super Fortress was the largest, most advanced bomber of the war. It was complex, powerful, and difficult to fly. WASP Dora Doherty and Dorothea Johnson Moorman were selected to demonstrate the B-29 to male pilots who were struggling with it. The women flew the massive bomber flawlessly, executing takeoffs, landings, and maneuvers that impressed the watching male pilots and officers. The demonstration boosted confidence in the aircraft and showed that if properly trained pilots could handle it, so could the men assigned to fly it in combat. But the work was dangerous. 38 WASP died during the program. 11 died in training accidents. 27 died on operational missions. Plane crashes mostly. Mechanical failures, pilot error, weather, mid-air collisions. Military aviation was inherently dangerous in the 1940s. Aircraft were less reliable. Safety standards were lower. Pilots took risks because the mission demanded it. When a WASP died, her fellow pilots would take up a collection to pay for the casket and shipping costs. The government wouldn't pay. There was no military funeral, no flag on the coffin, no honor guard. The dead WASP's family would receive her body and a letter of condolence. That was it. No death benefits, no military burial, no recognition that she died in service to her country. It was a bitter injustice. Gertrude Tompkins Silver was ferrying a P-51 Mustang from California to New Jersey in October 1944. She stopped to refuel in Indiana, then took off again. She never arrived in New Jersey. She never made radio contact. She and the P-51 disappeared. Search parties looked but found nothing. Her fate remains unknown. Did the plane crash? Did she bail out over remote terrain? Did she become disoriented and fly off course? No one knows. Gertrude Tompkins Silver was 28 years old. She's still listed as missing. On December 20th, 1944, the WASP program was officially disbanded. The women were given a speech thanking them for their service, handed their discharge papers, and sent home. No benefits, no veteran status, no further obligation from the government. Some WASP had been flying for more than 2 years. They'd logged thousands of flight hours. They'd delivered hundreds of aircraft. They'd served their country as fully as any military pilot. And now they were civilians again, with nothing to show for it except memories and a uniform they were no longer allowed to wear. For the next 33 years, former WASP fought for recognition. They lobbied Congress. They testified at hearings. They organized, wrote letters, told their stories. Finally, in 1977, President Jimmy Carter signed a bill granting WASP veteran status. They were officially recognized as having served in the military during World War II. They became eligible for veterans' benefits, 3 decades late, but finally acknowledged. In 2009, surviving WASP received the Congressional Gold Medal, one of the nation's highest civilian honors. By then, most were in their 80s or 90s. Many had already died. Smith College, Northampton, Massachusetts. February 1943. The college had been transformed into the U.S. Naval Reserve Midshipmen's School for Women. WAVE's officer candidates arrived on campus, moved into dormitories, and began training. The setting was academic, ivy-covered buildings, tree-lined paths, libraries, and classrooms. But the training was military. The women learned Navy regulations, ranks, protocol. They studied navigation, communications, ship recognition, Navy organization. They marched in formation. They saluted. They learned to follow orders and give orders. The WAVE's uniform was designed by Mainbacher, a top American fashion designer. The Navy wanted the uniforms to look professional and dignified. The result was stylish, dark blue jacket and skirt, white shirt, black tie, peaked cap. The WAVEs looked sharp. They looked official. That was the point. The Navy was proud of its traditions, its standards, its image. If women were going to wear Navy uniforms, those uniforms had to uphold the Navy's reputation. Unlike the Army's WASPs, who deployed overseas extensively, WAVEs were restricted to the continental United States. The law that created the WAVEs specified they could serve only on shore. No ships. No overseas stations. The Navy wanted women for stateside duty to free up men for sea duty and overseas assignments. Eventually, the restrictions were loosened slightly. WAVEs were allowed to serve in Alaska, Hawaii, and the Caribbean, but they never served on combat ships during World War II. Despite these restrictions, WAVEs filled critical roles. The majority worked as yeomen, the Navy's clerical specialists. About 14,000 WAVEs were yeomen handling paperwork, personnel files, correspondence, reports. Every piece of paper that moved through the Navy went through yeomen. It was meticulous, demanding work. Errors could have serious consequences, supplies sent to the wrong place, personnel assigned incorrectly, orders misunderstood. The yeomen had to be precise. About 13,000 WAVEs served as hospital corpsmen, the Navy's medical specialists. They worked in naval hospitals stateside, caring for wounded sailors and Marines returning from the Pacific. Burns from ship fires, shrapnel wounds, infections, amputations, trauma. The corpsmen changed dressings, administered medications, monitored patients, assisted in surgeries. Many of the wounded had been through hell, the sinking of ships, battles on Pacific islands, kamikaze attacks. The corpsmen provided not just medical care but emotional support, helping men recover physically and mentally. What if I told you waves mastered some of the most technical jobs in the military? They became aviation mechanics, learning to maintain and repair aircraft engines, hydraulic systems, electrical systems. Some waves worked on link trainers, flight simulators, teaching pilots to fly by instruments. They became parachute riggers, carefully packing parachutes that pilots' lives depended on. They worked as aerographers' mates, providing weather forecasts critical for flight operations and ship movements. They became radio operators, sending and receiving messages in Morse code, monitoring frequencies, maintaining communications equipment. Some of the most important work waves did was classified and remained classified for decades. In Washington, D.C., hundreds of waves worked for the Office of Naval Communications, breaking enemy codes. They worked alongside male cryptanalysts, deciphering Japanese naval codes and ciphers. The intelligence gathered from these decrypted messages gave American commanders critical information about enemy movements, plans, and capabilities. The codebreakers contributed directly to victories like Midway and the Philippine Sea. They couldn't tell anyone what they did. Not during the war. Not for years afterward. They worked in secure buildings, signed secrecy oaths, and kept silent. Waves also worked as control tower operators at naval air stations, directing aircraft taking off and landing. They worked in supply depots, managing inventory and distribution. They worked in administrative offices at the Pentagon, at fleet headquarters, at training stations. They worked in laboratories, in recruiting offices, in public affairs. By 1945, waves were doing more than 200 different jobs in the Navy. They were everywhere. The Navy's evaluation of waves' performance was overwhelmingly positive. Admiral Chester Nimitz, Commander-in-Chief of the Pacific Fleet, said that waves had released officers and men for sea duty and have contributed materially to the successful prosecution of the war. Admiral Ernest King, Chief of Naval Operations, stated that waves were indispensable to the Navy's functioning. The initial skepticism had evaporated. Waves had proved themselves. Remember that the other services had their women's branches too. The Coast Guard spars from the Coast Guard motto, Semper Paratus, always ready, numbered about 10,000 by war's end. They served in similar roles to waves, handling clerical work, communications, and logistics at Coast Guard stations. The Marine Corps Women's Reserve, about 23,000 strong, included women working as clerks, drivers, cooks, mechanics, and even drill instructors. The Marines were the most resistant service to accepting women, but once the Women's Reserve was established, the Corps treated them as Marines. The Commandant, General Thomas Holcomb, initially opposed a Women's Reserve, but later admitted he'd been wrong. The women Marines performed excellently. The transformation from WAC to WAC in July 1943 was a watershed. For the first time, American women were full members of the United States Army. They had ranks, from private to colonel. They received the same base pay as men of equivalent rank. They were entitled to the same benefits, medical care, insurance, allotments for dependents. If they died in service, their families received death benefits and they received military burials. It was what should have been granted from the beginning, but political and cultural resistance had prevented it. The change energized recruiting. Women who had hesitated because of the auxiliary status now enlisted. The WAC needed to grow rapidly. The Army was expanding for the invasion of Europe and the continued Pacific Campaign. More troops meant more administrative work, more communications to handle, more supplies to track, more personnel to manage. WACs could do all of that. The slogan remained, "Release a man for combat." By the end of 1943, there were 60,000 WACs. By mid-1944, 80,000. The peak came in 1945 with just over 100,000 WACs serving simultaneously. Over the course of the war, about 150,000 women served in the WAC. They ranged in age from 20 to 50, though most were in their 20s. They came from every state, every background. Teachers, secretaries, factory workers, college students, housewives, farm girls. Some had never been more than 20 miles from home. Others had traveled extensively. The military brought them together. Training at Fort Des Moines and other WAC training centers standardized at 6 weeks for enlisted and 8 weeks for officers. The women learned military discipline, drill, physical fitness, first aid, and the basics of their assigned jobs. Then they were sent to their duty stations, Army posts in the United States or overseas assignments. About 8,000 WACs deployed to the European theater. About 5,500 deployed to the Southwest Pacific Theater. In the Pacific, WACs served under General Douglas MacArthur. MacArthur had been skeptical at first, but changed his mind when he saw their performance. He requested more WACs, specifically asking for women with specialized skills, cryptographers, translators, photo interpreters. The WACs in the Pacific worked in headquarters in Australia, New Guinea, the Philippines. They processed intelligence, handled communications, managed supplies. When MacArthur returned to the Philippines in October 1944, WACs were part of his headquarters staff. They waited ashore at late weeks after the initial invasion, setting up operations in combat zones. Consider what these women faced daily. The conditions in the Pacific were harsh. Heat, humidity, insects, disease. Malaria was a constant threat. Dengue fever, dysentery, tropical infections. Living conditions were primitive tents, makeshift buildings, no air conditioning. The women adapted. They took anti-malarial drugs, used mosquito netting, endured the heat. They worked long hours because there was always more work than people to do it. They didn't complain, at least not officially. Complaining would confirm the stereotype that women couldn't handle hardship. In Europe, WACs served in England, France, Belgium, and Germany. They worked at Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force under Eisenhower, at Army Group Headquarters, at airbases, at supply depots. They processed the mountains of paperwork required to coordinate Allied operations. They decoded messages, plotted maps, tracked units, managed logistics. Some WACs worked in photo interpretation, analyzing reconnaissance images to identify targets, fortifications, troop concentrations. Their work contributed directly to mission planning and execution. When the Allies liberated concentration camps in 1945, some WACs saw the evidence of Nazi atrocities. They processed documentation, helped organize relief efforts, witnessed horrors that would stay with them forever. They couldn't process it immediately. There was too much work to do. The war hadn't ended yet. Processing trauma would come later. WACs held ranks from private to colonel. The highest-ranking WAC was Director Hobby, who held the rank of colonel. She was the first woman to receive officers' rank in the U.S. Army aside from nurses. Other senior WACs commanded training centers, oversaw operations, and advised commanders on women's issues. The majority of WACs were enlisted women, privates, corporals, sergeants. They did the hands-on work. They typed the reports, operated the switchboards, drove the trucks, maintained the files. It wasn't glamorous, but it was essential. Here's a unit that deserves special recognition. The 6,888th Central Postal Directory Battalion was the only all-black WAC unit deployed overseas. 855 African American women, commanded by Major Charity Adams. They deployed to England in February 1945 with a specific mission: clear the enormous backlog of undelivered mail. Warehouses in Birmingham, England, were filled with millions of pieces of mail that couldn't be delivered because addresses were incomplete, illegible, or outdated. Soldiers moved constantly. Units were transferred. Men were killed, wounded, missing. The mail piled up. The backlog was severely affecting morale. Mail from home was critical to soldiers' mental health. Letters from wives, girlfriends, parents, children. Care packages. News from home. When mail didn't arrive, soldiers assumed they'd been forgotten. No mail, low morale was an established fact. The 6888th's mission was to fix it. The working conditions were terrible. The warehouse was unheated, poorly lit, infested with rats. The mail was jumbled, chaotic. Some letters had been sitting for years. The 6888th organized a system. They set up card files, tracking names and units. They established procedures for cross-referencing, forwarding, and returning mail. They worked in 3 shifts, around the clock, 7 days a week. The motto was no mail, low morale. They made it personal. The British command estimated it would take 6 months to clear the backlog. The 6888th did it in 3. They processed an average of 65,000 pieces of mail per shift. They traced soldiers who had moved, been promoted, been transferred, been wounded. They returned mail to families of soldiers who had been killed. They reunited soldiers with letters from home. And they did it while facing discrimination. The 6888th faced double prejudice, racism, and sexism. Some British civilians resented them. Some white American soldiers resented them. They were ordered to use segregated facilities. They were subjected to insults and harassment. But they maintained discipline and professionalism. They did their jobs excellently. Major Adams was a fierce advocate for her unit, standing up to commanders who tried to impose unfair treatment. When a general tried to inspect the unit and implied they weren't performing adequately, Adams famously told him that she was the only person who would command her battalion. The general backed down. After clearing the backlog in England, the 6888th deployed to France to handle mail operations there. They continued their work until the war ended. Then they were sent home, discharged, and largely forgotten. It wasn't until decades later that the 6888th began to receive recognition. In 2022, President Biden signed a bill awarding the Congressional Gold Medal to the 6888th. Most of the women were gone by then, but the surviving members received the honor they deserved since 1945. While hundreds of thousands of women were serving in uniform, millions more were serving in factories. The defense industry expansion during World War II was staggering. In 1940, the United States produced fewer than 3,000 military aircraft. In 1944, it produced 96,000. Shipyards that had been quiet for years were launching a new ship every few days. Tank factories, ammunition plants, electronics facilities, the entire nation was mobilized for production. And women were the workforce that made it possible. In 1940, about 12 million American women were employed. By 1944, that number had grown to more than 19 million, an increase of 60%. The female labor force participation rate jumped from 27% to 37%. Women went from being 1/4 of the civilian workforce to more than 1/3. And the nature of their work changed dramatically. Before the war, most employed women worked in traditional women's jobs: teaching, nursing, domestic service, retail, clerical work. Those sectors were considered appropriate for women. But manufacturing, construction, transportation, and heavy industry were men's domains. The war shattered that division. With 12 million men in uniform, factories desperate for workers had no choice. They started hiring women for jobs that had always been closed to them. Think about how radical this shift was. The defense industry saw the most dramatic change. In 1940, women were just 4.5% of workers in aircraft manufacturing. By 1944, they were 39%. The aircraft industry alone employed over 300,000 women. In shipbuilding, women went from virtually zero to hundreds of thousands. Kaiser shipyards in Richmond, California, employed thousands of women as welders, riveters, electricians, and crane operators. The government launched propaganda campaigns to encourage women to take these jobs. The message was patriotic duty. Your country needs you. Work in a factory to bring the boys home sooner. The most famous symbol of this campaign was Rosie the Riveter. The name came from a 1942 song by Red Evans and John Jacob Loeb about a woman working in an aircraft factory. Norman Rockwell painted a muscular, confident Rosie for a May 1943 Saturday Evening Post cover. And in 1943, Howard Miller created the "We Can Do It" poster for Westinghouse showing a woman in a bandana flexing her arm. That image became iconic, though it wasn't widely seen during the war. It became famous decades later as a feminist symbol. The reality behind the symbol was complicated. Women who went to work in defense plants faced significant challenges. The work was physically demanding. Welding required holding heavy equipment for hours. Riveting involved repetitive motion with heavy tools. Assembly line work was fast-paced and exhausting. Shifts were long, 10 to 12 hours was common. Plants operated around the clock, so women worked day shifts, swing shifts, night shifts. Many women were working outside the home for the first time in their lives and had to adjust to industrial work schedules and demands. Women with children faced additional burdens. Childcare was a major issue. Some defense plants set up on-site childcare centers. The Kaiser shipyards operated two 24-hour childcare facilities that cared for thousands of children. But most plants didn't provide childcare and communities didn't have enough capacity. Women made do. They relied on relatives, neighbors, and older children. Some took their children to sitters who watched dozens of kids in cramped apartments. Some left children home alone. It wasn't ideal, but the war demanded sacrifices. Rationing affected everyone. Food, gasoline, rubber, and metal were rationed to support the war effort. Women managed household rationing on top of their factory work. They stood in line for groceries after working a 10-hour shift. They planted victory gardens to supplement food supplies. They collected scrap metal, old tires, tin cans, anything that could be recycled for the war effort. They bought war bonds to finance military operations. The home front mobilization was massive, and women carried much of the burden. Despite working the same jobs as men, women were paid significantly less. The average weekly wage for a woman in manufacturing in 1944 was about $31. For men, it was about $55. The wage gap was even larger in skilled positions. Unions and women's groups pushed for equal pay for equal work, but progress was slow. Employers justified lower wages by claiming women were less productive, less skilled, or only working temporarily. None of these justifications held up under scrutiny, but they persisted. Sexual harassment and discrimination were common. Male workers often resented women entering their workplaces. Some men sabotaged women's work, hid tools, spread rumors, or made inappropriate comments. Women learned to ignore it, confront it, or report it, though reporting often accomplished little. Supervisors and managers were almost always men, and they didn't always take women's complaints seriously. Women developed strategies for survival. They formed alliances with other women. They proved their competence so thoroughly that men couldn't deny it. They earned respect through skill and determination. Yet despite these challenges, many women loved their jobs. They were making good money, more than they'd ever earned before, even if it was less than men made. They were learning valuable skills. They were doing work that mattered, building planes that pilots would fly, welding ships that sailors would crew, assembling tanks that soldiers would drive. They could see the direct connection between their work and the war effort. It was meaningful in a way that domestic service or clerical work often wasn't. Some women discovered talents they hadn't known they had. Women who had been homemakers became skilled welders. Women who had worked in retail became machinists. Women learned to read blueprints, operate lathes, rivet aluminum, wire electrical systems. They took pride in their craftsmanship. There are photos from the era showing women workers grease-stained, bandana-wrapped, smiling with satisfaction. They were good at what they did, and they knew it. By 1944, 6 million women were working in defense industries. Millions more worked in other sectors: agriculture, transportation, utilities, government. The economy was running at full capacity, and women were keeping it running. Without them, the arsenal of democracy couldn't have produced the weapons that won the war. General Eisenhower acknowledged this after the war, saying that American production was a decisive factor in victory. And American production depended on American women. Ask yourself what happened next. Surveys conducted during the war asked women workers if they planned to keep working after the war ended. Between 61 and 85% said yes. They wanted to keep their jobs. They'd proven they could do the work. They'd earned decent wages. They gained independence and confidence. They didn't want to give that up and go back to being housewives or low-paid clerks. But what women wanted and what would happen were two very different things. By late 1943 and early 1944, the question wasn't whether women could serve. The question was how the Allies could possibly win without them. The statistics told the story. Over 300,000 women in uniform, 6 million women in defense industries, millions more in agriculture, transportation, and other war-critical sectors. The American war machine, the most powerful military-industrial complex the world had ever seen, depended on women. General Dwight Eisenhower stated it plainly. He told Army Chief of Staff George Marshall that he could not run his headquarters without WASPs. They were indispensable. When he became Supreme Commander of Allied forces in Europe, one of his first requests was for more WASPs. He needed them for intelligence work, communications, supply coordination, personnel management. The invasion of Europe was the largest and most complex military operation in history. It required meticulous planning, perfect coordination, and flawless execution. WASPs were central to making it happen. In the months leading up to D-Day, WASPs assigned to SHAF headquarters in England worked around the clock. They processed intelligence reports from resistance networks in France. They prepared maps showing every beach, every road, every fortification along the Normandy coast. They coordinated logistics, calculating how many ships, landing craft, tanks, trucks, and tons of supplies would be needed. They tracked the location and readiness of every Allied unit. They typed orders, filed reports, maintained communications. The scope of planning was staggering, and it generated mountains of paperwork. WASPs handled it. Photo interpreters, some of them WASPs, analyzed thousands of reconnaissance images taken by aircraft flying over German-held territory. They identified gun emplacements, troop concentrations, supply depots, headquarters buildings. They tracked changes from one day to the next, noting new fortifications or troop movements. This intelligence was critical for planners deciding where to land, where to expect resistance, where to concentrate firepower. Lives depended on accurate photo interpretation. The women doing this work understood the stakes. Parachute riggers, many of them WAVs and WACs, packed the parachutes that paratroopers would use in the D-Day drop. Every fold had to be perfect. Every line had to be checked. A mistake could mean a parachute that wouldn't open, a soldier falling to his death. The riggers took extraordinary care. They knew that men they'd never meet were trusting them with their lives. On the night of June 5th to 6th, thousands of American and British paratroopers jumped over Normandy. Their parachutes opened. The riggers had done their jobs. Codebreakers, including WAVs in Washington, intercepted and decoded German communications in the weeks before D-Day. The Germans knew an invasion was coming. They didn't know where or when. The Allies ran an elaborate deception operation to convince the Germans that the invasion would come at Calais, not Normandy. Intelligence from decoded messages confirmed that the deception was working. The Germans were keeping divisions at Calais even after the Normandy landings began, believing the real invasion was still coming. That intelligence advantage saved countless Allied lives. Nurses prepared for the invasion knowing they'd be treating massive casualties. Field hospitals were set up in England, ready to receive wounded men evacuated from France. Hospital ships were positioned in the English Channel. Everything was ready, and on June 6, 1944, the invasion began. Within hours, casualties were pouring in. Nurses worked in operating theaters for days without rest. Blood, morphine, surgery, bandages, over and over. Men with shrapnel wounds, bullet wounds, burns, amputations, trauma. The nurses saved thousands of lives in those first days. Many soldiers later wrote or said that seeing a nurse's face was the moment they knew they'd survive. For days after D-Day, nurses landed on Omaha Beach. They set up field hospitals within range of German artillery. The fighting was still ongoing. The beaches were still under fire. But the wounded couldn't wait. The nurses waited ashore carrying medical supplies, established operating tents, and started treating casualties. Over the next months, as Allied forces advanced across France, the nurses followed. Mobile hospitals moved with the armies, staying close behind the front lines so wounded men could receive treatment quickly. The faster a wounded soldier received care, the better his chances of survival. In the Pacific, the war continued with brutal intensity. Island-hopping campaigns, Tarawa, Kwajalein, Saipan, Peleliu, Iwo Jima, Okinawa, produced horrific casualties. Nurses worked in field hospitals on tropical islands, in sweltering heat, fighting disease as well as treating combat wounds. Malaria, dengue fever, dysentery, and tropical infections killed or incapacitated thousands of soldiers. Nurses managed these cases while also treating men wounded in combat. The conditions were primitive. Supplies were limited. They improvised constantly. WACs in the Pacific handled communications that coordinated operations across thousands of miles of ocean. They processed intelligence about Japanese troop movements and naval operations. They managed supply lines that stretched from the United States to forward bases scattered across the Pacific. The logistics of fighting a war across an ocean were staggering. Every bullet, every ration, every gallon of fuel had to be shipped thousands of miles. WACs tracked it all, ensured it arrived where it was needed, and kept the system functioning. By 1944, the early skepticism about women in the military had evaporated among those who worked with them. Commanders who had opposed the idea were now requesting more women. Officers who had doubted their capabilities were now praising their performance. The women had proven themselves not through rhetoric but through competence. They showed up. They did the work. They met every standard. They exceeded expectations. The statistics bore this out. Disciplinary rates for WACs and waves were lower than for male soldiers and sailors in comparable positions. Efficiency ratings were equal or higher. Commanders reported that women adapted well to military life, followed orders conscientiously, and took initiative when appropriate. The stereotype of women as emotional or unreliable was exposed as false. Under pressure, under stress, in difficult conditions, the women performed. In factories, women's productivity matched or exceeded men's in most jobs. Training time was comparable. Accident rates were similar. Quality of work was equal. The claims that women couldn't do industrial work, that they lacked the physical strength or stamina, were disproven by millions of women doing exactly that work every day for years. By 1944, defense contractors who had resisted hiring women were now actively recruiting them. They needed workers, and women were available, capable, and reliable. The turning point had come. Women hadn't just helped with the war effort. They'd become essential to it. The United States couldn't have fielded the military it fielded without women in uniform. It couldn't have produced the weapons it produced without women in factories. Victory depended on them, and everyone knew it. But that service came at a cost. 38 WASP died flying military aircraft. 16 Army nurses were killed by enemy action. More than 200 other service women died from disease, accidents, and other causes. Each death was a loss. Each woman who died left behind family, friends, dreams unfulfilled. Stop and consider the injustice that followed. The WASP deaths were particularly painful because of the bureaucratic injustice surrounding them. When WASP pilot Cornelia Fort was killed in a mid-air collision in March 1943, her fellow pilots wanted to give her a military funeral. They couldn't. She wasn't military. When WASP pilot Margaret Oldenburg died in a crash in June 1944, her family paid to have her body shipped home. The government contributed nothing. When WASP pilot Mabel Rawlinson was killed in a crash in August 1943, her sister, who was also a WASP, helped collect money to cover funeral expenses. These women died serving their country, and their country didn't acknowledge it. The nurses who died were at least recognized as military personnel. Second Lieutenant Ruth Gardiner was killed when her hospital ship was attacked in the Mediterranean in 1943. First Lieutenant Ellen Ainsworth was killed by German artillery fire during the Battle of Anzio in Italy in February 1944. She was posthumously awarded the Silver Star for gallantry. First Lieutenant Mary Roberts was killed when Japanese fighters attacked her plane during an evacuation flight in the Pacific in March 1945. These women were honored as fallen soldiers. Their families received benefits. They were buried with military ceremonies. Lieutenant Frances Slanger's death was particularly poignant. Her letter to Stars and Stripes, praising the courage of the soldiers she'd treated, was published the day after she was killed. Soldiers across Europe read her words and were moved. They wrote letters in response, not knowing she was gone. The letters kept coming for weeks. Her commanding officer had to respond, informing the letter writers that Lieutenant Slanger had been killed. Many soldiers who had been treated by nurses wrote that they owed their lives to those women. They wanted the nurses to know they were appreciated. Frances Slanger knew, but she didn't live to receive their thanks. The 68 American military women taken prisoner by the Japanese in the Philippines in 1942 endured years of captivity. They were mostly Army and Navy nurses. They'd been serving in military hospitals when the Philippines fell. They were interned at Santo Tomas Camp in Manila, along with thousands of civilian prisoners. Conditions were harsh. Food was scarce, sanitation poor, medical supplies almost non-existent. The nurses continued working, caring for sick and injured prisoners with almost no resources. They improvised. They made do. They saved lives. When American forces liberated Santo Tomas in February 1945, the nurses were emaciated, sick, and exhausted. But they were alive, and they'd maintained their professional standards throughout captivity. Several were awarded decorations for their service and valor during internment. They'd upheld the highest traditions of the nurse corps under the worst conditions imaginable. Beyond deaths and captivity, there was the ordinary cost of wartime service: separation from families, long hours, exhaustion, stress, fear, loneliness. Women in uniform spent months or years away from home, missing weddings, births, deaths, all the important family moments. They couldn't be there when their mothers got sick, when their children took their first steps, when their siblings graduated. They sacrificed those moments to serve. You might wonder how they sustained themselves through all this. Women working in defense plants sacrificed too. They worked 10 or 12-hour shifts, 6 or 7 days a week. They came home exhausted, had to cook dinner, care for children, manage households. Sleep was limited. Rest was rare. Some women worked these schedules for years. The fatigue was cumulative. The stress was constant. And they couldn't complain because complaining meant you weren't committed to the war effort. Industrial accidents were common. Factories operating at maximum capacity, with workers pushed to their limits, were dangerous places. Women lost fingers in machinery. They were burned by welding torches. They fell from scaffolding. They were injured by falling objects. Some injuries were minor. Some were disabling. Some were fatal. Safety standards existed, but production pressures often led to shortcuts. Workers were expected to be careful, to stay alert, to avoid accidents even when exhausted. The psychological toll was significant, though it wasn't recognized at the time. Post-traumatic stress disorder wasn't a diagnosis in the 1940s. Shell shock was acknowledged for combat soldiers, but the stress experienced by nurses, by women in uniform, by factory workers, by anyone on the home front wasn't considered a medical issue. People were expected to cope, to be strong, to not break down. So they carried their trauma silently. Nurses who treated thousands of wounded and dying soldiers, who performed surgery after surgery in field hospitals under fire, who saw things no one should see, they came home with those memories. They had nightmares. They had flashbacks. They had emotional wounds that never fully healed. But they didn't talk about it. They moved on with their lives, carrying the burden. Women who lost husbands, brothers, sons, fathers in the war, they grieved while continuing to work, to raise children, to keep society functioning. Gold Star mothers and wives displayed flags in their windows, signifying their loss. The community knew, but life went on. There wasn't time to fully grieve. The war was still being fought. Other women's husbands and sons were still in danger. Everyone had to keep going. Yet despite the costs, despite the sacrifices, the women persevered. They kept working. They kept serving. They kept contributing. Because they believed in what they were doing. They believed in defeating fascism. They believed in defending democracy. They believed in protecting freedom. Those ideals were worth the sacrifice. And they were determined to see it through to victory. May 8, 1945. VE Day. Victory in Europe. Germany surrendered unconditionally. The war in Europe was over. WASP in Paris, London, Brussels, and Frankfurt celebrated with Allied troops. Nurses in field hospitals across Germany treated the last casualties of the European war. Waves in Washington processed the paperwork that officially ended operations in Europe. Women in factories paused their work to cheer, to cry, to feel relief. The end was in sight. But the war wasn't over. Japan was still fighting. The Pacific Campaign continued. Okinawa had just been secured at enormous cost. 12,000 American dead, 38,000 wounded. The planned invasion of Japan was expected to produce casualties in the hundreds of thousands, possibly millions. Women in uniform and in factories knew their work wasn't done. They kept going. Then, August 6th and 9th, 1945. Atomic bombs dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. August 15th, 1945, VJ Day. Japan surrendered. The war was over. Completely over. The fighting stopped. After nearly 4 years of total war, America could finally exhale. The celebrations were massive. In cities and towns across America, people poured into the streets. They cheered, hugged strangers, cried with relief and joy. Servicemen and servicewomen in uniform were embraced, thanked, celebrated. The famous photograph of a sailor kissing a nurse in Times Square captured the mood, pure, unrestrained joy. The nightmare was over. The boys were coming home. Life could return to normal. For the women who had served, VJ Day was bittersweet. They felt the joy and relief. They'd contributed to victory. They'd done their part. They'd proven women could serve. But they also knew what was coming. They'd be sent home. Their services would no longer be needed. The jobs they'd done, the roles they'd filled, the independence they'd gained, it was all temporary. The war was the exception. Now came the return to normal. Look at the final tally of women's contributions. 350,000 women served in military uniform, WAC, WAVES, WASP, SPARS, Marines, Army Nurse Corps, Navy Nurse Corps. 6 million women worked in defense industries at the war's peak. Millions more worked in agriculture, transportation, government, and other war-critical sectors. Women bought war bonds, planted victory gardens, volunteered for civil defense, collected scrap metal, managed rationing. The entire nation had been mobilized, and women were central to that mobilization. American industrial production during the war was the decisive material advantage that allowed the Allies to win. The United States produced 300,000 aircraft, 86,000 tanks, 8,000 naval vessels, millions of tons of ammunition, and countless other weapons and supplies. That production was the arsenal of democracy, and women built it. Rosie the Riveter wasn't just a propaganda symbol. She was millions of real women who went to work every day and built the weapons that won the war. Military commanders acknowledged this. General Eisenhower said that American production was a key factor in Allied victory. Admiral Chester Nimitz praised WAVES for their contributions to the Navy's success in the Pacific. General Douglas MacArthur commended the WACs who served under him. These weren't empty compliments. These were acknowledgments from military leaders who understood that victory required more than soldiers on the battlefield. It required support, logistics, intelligence, communications, production. Women provided all of that. Victory parades in the summer and fall of 1945 included women in uniform. WACs, WAVES, Marines, nurses marched alongside male soldiers and sailors. Crowds cheered them. For a moment, women's contributions were visible and celebrated. They'd served. They'd sacrificed. They'd earned the nation's gratitude. And they received it briefly. But even as the celebrations continued, demobilization was beginning. The war was over. The military needed to shrink back to peacetime size. Defense plants needed to convert to civilian production. Millions of servicemen were being discharged. They needed jobs. They needed their old lives back. And society expected that women would step aside to make room for them. Here's how quickly things changed. The demobilization of women from military service was swift. In September 1945, at the end of the war, there were more than 86,000 WACs on active duty. By June 1946, there were fewer than 8,500. More than 90% were discharged in less than a year. Wave strength dropped similarly. Most waves were discharged by the end of 1946. The Army Nurse Corps shrank from 57,000 to around 8,500. The Navy Nurse Corps reduced from 11,000 to about 1,500. The military didn't need them anymore, so they were sent home. The WASP program had already been shut down in December 1944, before the war even ended. The women received a brief speech thanking them for their service, discharge papers, and that was it. No benefits. No veteran status. They were civilians again, with nothing official to show for their years of military flying except memories and scrapbooks. Women in defense industries faced mass layoffs. Factories converted back to civilian production or closed. The jobs women had held for 4 years were suddenly gone, or they were given to returning veterans. Women were laid off in huge numbers. In the aircraft industry alone, hundreds of thousands of women lost their jobs between 1945 and 1946. Shipyards that had employed thousands of women welders and riveters laid them off and hired men. The message was clear: the emergency was over and women needed to make room for men. Many women protested. They'd done the work successfully for years. They'd proven their competence. They wanted to keep their jobs. But the cultural and economic pressure was overwhelming. Unions, which had barely supported women workers during the war, now prioritized jobs for male members. Employers, who had hired women out of necessity, now preferred to hire men. Government policy encouraged veterans' employment. The GI Bill provided education and job training for veterans, mostly men. The message from government, employers, and media was consistent: women should go home. Picture how dramatically the propaganda shifted. During the war, the government and media had celebrated women workers. Rosie the Riveter was a national icon. Women in uniform were praised as patriots. But after the war, the message changed. Now, the media celebrated domesticity. Women's magazines ran articles about homemaking, cooking, decorating, raising children. The ideal woman was a wife and mother, not a factory worker or soldier. Television shows and movies depicted happy suburban families with stay-at-home mothers. The career woman was portrayed as unhappy, unfulfilled, destined to regret her choices. Many women did return to domestic life. They'd been working long hours for years. They were exhausted. They wanted to reunite with husbands, start families, build homes. The marriage rate spiked in 1946. The birth rate soared, the beginning of the baby boom. Millions of women chose to focus on family. That was a legitimate choice, and for many women, it brought satisfaction and fulfillment. But not all women wanted that. Surveys conducted in 1944 and 1945 showed that between 61 and 85% of women working in defense industries wanted to keep working after the war. They liked earning their own money. They liked the independence. They liked doing meaningful work. They discovered abilities they didn't know they had. They wanted careers, not just jobs. But society didn't want to give them that option. Women veterans faced particular challenges. They'd served in uniform. They'd done jobs that were important, responsible, sometimes dangerous. They'd been officers, sergeants, specialists. They'd commanded units, made decisions, led people, and now they were expected to go home and be housewives. Many struggled with the transition. They'd had purpose, responsibility, and respect in the military. Civilian life as a woman in the 1940s offered limited opportunities for those things. The GI Bill provided educational benefits to veterans. Women veterans were eligible, and some took advantage. They went to college or nursing school on GI Bill benefits. They pursued degrees and careers. but the majority of GI Bill benefits went to men, simply because there were far more male veterans. And even with degrees, women faced discrimination in the workforce. Professions like law, medicine, engineering, and business were heavily male-dominated and resistant to women. For women of color, the situation was even more challenging. African American women who had served in the military or worked in defense industries faced both racism and sexism in post-war America. Job opportunities were limited. Educational opportunities were limited. Many returned to domestic service or other low-paying work. The contributions they'd made during the war were overlooked or forgotten. Still, women had learned things they couldn't unlearn. They'd learned self-reliance. They'd learned confidence. They'd learned that they could do far more than society had told them they could. They'd worked alongside other women, formed friendships, built networks. They'd seen possibilities. Those lessons and connections would shape the rest of their lives, and they would influence the next generation. The immediate post-war years saw women pushed back into traditional roles, but the fight for recognition and equality continued. In 1948, Congress passed the Women's Armed Services Integration Act. This law allowed women to serve as permanent members of the regular armed forces, not just reserves or temporary wartime units. It was a significant step. Women could now have military careers, but the law imposed severe restrictions. Women could make up no more than 2% of the force. They couldn't be promoted beyond lieutenant colonel or commander. They couldn't command men. Married women could be discharged if they became pregnant. These restrictions remained in place for decades. For WASP, the fight for recognition took even longer. From 1945 to 1977, they weren't considered veterans. They'd flown military aircraft on military missions under military orders. But bureaucratically, they'd been civil service employees. They weren't eligible for veterans' benefits. They couldn't be buried in military cemeteries. They couldn't get VA healthcare or home loans. It was a bitter injustice. In the 1970s, surviving WASP organized a campaign for recognition. They contacted members of Congress. They testified at hearings. They told their stories. They documented their service. Senator Barry Goldwater, himself a pilot, championed their cause. Finally, in November 1977, President Jimmy Carter signed a bill granting WASP veteran status, 33 years after they'd served. Many WASP had already died, but those still living finally received the recognition they deserved. The original WACS, the 16,000 women who served before the WAC was created, faced a similar situation. Because they'd been auxiliary, not Army, they initially weren't eligible for full veterans benefits. In 1980, Congress finally corrected this, granting former WACs full veteran status, 38 years after they'd served. Better late than never, but it shouldn't have taken that long. Recognition from military nurses came more readily, since they'd always had military status. But their contributions were often minimized or forgotten. The focus was on combat soldiers. Nurses were remembered, if at all, as angels of mercy, kind and caring, but not particularly important to military success. This diminished their actual role. They'd been medical professionals making life or death decisions under extreme conditions. They'd saved thousands of lives. They'd endured danger and hardship. Their contributions were as essential as any soldiers. Slowly, over decades, recognition grew. Books were written. Documentaries were produced. Memorials were built. In 2009, the surviving WASP received the Congressional Gold Medal, one of the nation's highest civilian honors. About 300 WASP were still alive to receive it. They traveled to Washington, most in their 80s or 90s, to be honored by Congress and the President. They wore their WASP uniforms or pins. They stood proudly. The recognition came 65 years late, but it came. In 2022, the 6,888th Central Postal Directory Battalion received the Congressional Gold Medal. Only a handful of the more than 800 women who served were still alive. But the recognition acknowledged their groundbreaking service. the only all-black WAC unit deployed overseas, performing an essential mission under difficult conditions while facing discrimination. Consider how military integration of women progressed from there. In 1976, women were admitted to the military academies, West Point, Naval Academy, Air Force Academy for the first time. The first classes graduated in 1980. These women faced intense scrutiny and harassment, but they persevered. They proved women could meet academy standards. They became officers. In 1991, Congress repealed the law excluding women from combat aviation. Women began flying combat missions. In 1993, the ban on women serving on combat ships was lifted. Women began serving on Navy vessels. In 2013, the Pentagon lifted the ban on women in ground combat positions. All military occupational specialties were open to women who could meet the standards. In 2015 and 2016, the first women completed Army Ranger School and Marine Infantry training. Full integration finally arrived more than 70 years after World War II proved women could serve. Fast forward to today. Women make up about 16% of the U.S. military. There have been female generals and admirals. Women have commanded combat units, flown fighter jets, served in special operations. Women serve in every role, in every branch, at every rank. This was made possible because 350,000 women in World War II proved it could be done. The women who served in World War II changed America. They didn't win full equality immediately. They faced decades of resistance and discrimination, but they planted seeds that grew into profound social change. The image of Rosie the Riveter endured. The "We Can Do It" poster, barely noticed during the war, became an icon in the 1980s and beyond. It was adopted by the feminist movement as a symbol of women's strength and capability. That image, a woman in work clothes, flexing her arm, confident and determined, represented a challenge to traditional gender roles. It said women could do anything. That message resonated across generations. The women who'd served in World War II raised daughters who came of age in the 1960s and 1970s. Those daughters grew up hearing stories about what their mothers had done during the war. They knew women could work in factories, serve in the military, do things society said women couldn't do. When the women's liberation movement emerged, those lessons mattered. The second-wave feminists of the 1960s and 1970s were building on foundations laid by their mothers' generation. The economic independence women gained during the war, however briefly, showed what was possible. Women who'd earned decent wages, managed their own money, supported themselves or their families, they knew they didn't have to be economically dependent on men. Even if they returned to traditional roles after the war, they carried that knowledge, and they passed it to their daughters. The expectation that women could and should work outside the home gained strength in each generation. The military contributions of women in World War II created a precedent. Once women had served, it became impossible to argue they couldn't serve. The debate shifted from "can women serve" to "how should women serve?" That was progress. Slow progress, with setbacks and resistance. But forward movement nonetheless. The nurses, WACs, WAVs, WASP, Marines, and factory workers of World War II were part of what journalist Tom Brokaw called the greatest generation. That label typically referred to the men who fought in combat. But the women were part of that generation too. They faced a national crisis and answered the call. They served with courage, confidence, and determination. They sacrificed. They persevered. They contributed to victory. Their war was as real and important as any soldiers. For too long, their contributions were minimized or forgotten. History focused on battles, generals, and combat soldiers. The women who made those victories possible, the nurses who saved lives, the WACs who managed logistics, the factory workers who built the weapons, the WASP who ferried the planes, they were background figures in most narratives. That's changing. Historians are telling their stories. Museums are honoring their service. Documentaries and books are documenting their contributions. The women veterans of World War II are nearly all gone now. The youngest who served would be in their late 90s. Most have passed away, but they left a legacy. They showed that when the nation needed them, women could serve in any capacity. They showed that gender roles were social constructs, not biological imperatives. They showed that women were as capable, as brave, as dedicated as men. They showed that equality was possible. Today's servicewomen stand on their shoulders. Every woman who graduates from a military academy, who becomes a pilot, who commands a unit, who serves in combat, she's following a path cleared by the women of World War II. They were the pioneers. They faced the skepticism, the resistance, the discrimination. They proved it could be done. And because they did, the women who came after had opportunities that wouldn't have existed otherwise. The same is true in civilian life. Women in engineering, construction, manufacturing, transportation, they're working in fields that were opened, at least partially, by the women who worked in defense plants during World War II. The barriers didn't fall immediately. It took decades of continued effort, but the precedent was set. Women had done the work. No one could credibly claim women were incapable of industrial labor after millions of women spent years doing exactly that. Reflect on what this story really means. The story of how 350,000 American women transformed the U.S. military in World War II is really a story about what happens when necessity collides with prejudice. Prejudice said women couldn't serve. Necessity said they had to. Necessity won. And once women proved they could serve, once they demonstrated their competence and dedication, the old prejudices looked foolish. Not everyone changed their minds, but the ground shifted. These women didn't set out to be revolutionaries. They set out to serve their country in a time of crisis. They wanted to contribute to the war effort. They wanted to defeat fascism and defend democracy. They were patriots, not radicals. But by serving, by succeeding, by refusing to accept the limitations society placed on them, they changed the nation. They expanded the definition of what women could be and do. They created possibilities for future generations. The transformation wasn't complete by 1945. It wasn't complete by 1977 when WASP finally got veteran status. It wasn't complete in 2013 when all combat positions opened to women. The work of achieving full equality continues. But the women of World War II started something that couldn't be stopped. They proved that women belonged in the military, in factories, in any role they were capable of filling. They earned that place through their service and sacrifice. And they changed America forever. Their legacy is visible every time a woman puts on a military uniform. Every time a woman works in a traditionally male field. Every time someone challenges gender-based limitations. The women of World War II showed the way. They fought not just against fascism abroad, but against prejudice at home. And they won both battles, the first quickly, the second slowly, but both decisively. That's their legacy. That's how 350,000 American women transformed the U.S. military, the workforce, and the nation.